What's going on, everybody? Pastor Kevin coming back to you as part of virtual confirmation, and today we're in our second week of Holy Communion. Last week we talked about Holy Communion in terms of the elements. We talked about why we take communion, and we talked about what happens at the table. This week we're going to talk a little bit about Jesus' love, and we're going to talk about who communion is for. Because that's a really important question. Who is communion for? But we're going to start by talking about Jesus' love. And I want you to take a moment. If you have to close your eyes to do it, that's okay. And if you don't, that's okay too. And I want you to think about all the ways that you can think of that Jesus shows love. You might have to think through some Bible stories to do that. Think about, how does Jesus show love? Well, he often heals the sick. That's a common way of showing love. He often talks about good news to the poor and the oppressed. That's a way of showing love, proclaiming good news. He talks to a lot of the outcasts in society, like women or people who are foreign to Judea. That's a big deal. Those are all really good signs of how Jesus shows love. And Jesus also feeds people. In fact, it's one of the things Jesus does the most in the Gospels. He has a lot of meals. Meals in people's homes, meals while he's out on the road. He plucks grain, he breaks bread at a tax collector's home. He's kind of this all-around food guy. And as we know, he breaks bread at communion, at the story of the Last Supper. Do you guys have a favorite Bible story about how Jesus shows love? I do. And my favorite is a story called The Feeding of the 5,000. I don't really like that name because that's really only 5,000 men. The Bible even says it doesn't count the women and the children, and realistically it should count them. So we're going to call it the feeding of the 5,000, not counting the women and the children, because it's really the feeding probably of the 20,000 or however many were there. And in that story, Jesus and the disciples are surrounded by this large crowd, and it's late in the day, and the disciples tell Jesus to send them away so they can go get dinner, right? And Jesus tells the disciples to give the people something to eat from what they had. And they retort that all they have is 5 loaves and 2 fish. How is that going to feed 5,000 men, not including women and children? And then Jesus says to have the crowd sit down. And he blesses the food and he breaks it. And it feeds everyone. It feeds everyone. And we don't know how. It's a mystery. And I think we can leave it a mystery because the mystery is part of the power of the story. But Jesus feeds everyone. And not only feeds them, there's food left over. There's an abundance left over. When we come to communion, this is a special meal that Jesus shares with the people. Jesus breaks bread and shares wine. And in love, spreads it out to all of us. And it may not seem like much, and yet somehow every week it fills us. It's one of the powers of communion that's found in Jesus' love for us. We're going to come back and talk more about that story of the feeding of the 5,000. But I want to ask you another question, and that is, who is communion for? Who's allowed to come to the table? You might have even been to a church where not everyone's allowed to come to the table. But in our Lutheran tradition, everyone is allowed to come to the table. This meal is for you and everybody else. It's for you and the person next to you. It's for you and those people who come in off the street. In our Lutheran tradition, we say that communion is for all of those who believe in the words, "This is given for you and shed for you." Sometimes we don't know how to believe in those words, and still we come to the table because we believe that this meal is for all those who come, all of those who think that they can find Christ in the moment, or hope they can find Christ in the moment, or feel it in their bones that Christ will be there. This meal is for all of those who believe the words given and shed for you. Question that often comes up when we talk about that, though, is what happens if we don't think we're worthy of this meal? You ever come to communion not feeling worthy? You ever thinking there's stuff that you've done in your life that you don't deserve God's grace or love? Well, Jesus says if you believe, this meal is still here. Jesus says here you can find out that you are worthy. You are enough, because God believes that you are enough. And if you come as yourself, angry or tired or sleepy or fed up with the world, that's okay, because God feeds you here. But communion isn't just for you, it's for everyone else too. And I want to focus on that. In that feeding of the 5,000, I love that story because it's a reminder that communion is never about who can and can't come to the table, because Jesus, in the feeding of the 5,000, feeds everybody. Feeds everybody who comes to the table. And even then, there's more to share. So when we open the table of communion, this is God's love being open to all people. When you are at communion with whoever is next to you, this is God's love being open for both of you. And at that meal, at the feeding of the 5,000, I think about all the people who probably ate that day. There were probably men, the Bible names them, women and children. There were probably genderqueer folk. There were old people and young people and cranky little kids who couldn't stop whining. There were sinners, there were saints, there were crabby people, there were happy people, there were sad people. There were people who believed that Jesus might be the Messiah, and there were people who probably hated Jesus. And they all got to eat, because communion is the meal for all people. It's a place where love for all people can be found in the sacrament. A question that often gets asked to me is, communion even for the bad people? That's a hard one, right? Because a lot of times in our life we think that God is really only there for the good, or God should be only on the side of the good. Well, if we think back to the story when Jesus ate communion with the disciples at the Last Supper, Judas was at that table. The one who would betray Jesus was still Jesus' friend and was still welcome at the table. He ate alongside the other people, and Jesus loved him and still loves him. In our tradition, we believe that only God can judge. Only God has the decision on who is good and who is not. And at communion, God judges everyone good and everyone welcome. Sometimes that's tough for us people because guess what? We have people we don't like very much, right? Enemies, maybe. That might be a strong word for most of us, but there's people we just don't like. There's people we're having an argument with. There's people who maybe we just think are wrong. There's people who we're just mad at. And when they come to communion alongside of us, do they get the same love and grace we get, even when we think they don't deserve it? Well, one of my favorite things about being a pastor is that I get to give communion to everyone who comes to the table. Or I used to, that is, before COVID. But one of my favorite parts about it, one of the parts that reminds me of the true love of God is when people come to the table. I guarantee you, there's people who I'm not liking very much in the church. Sometimes I have congregants who make me cranky or who have done things that I'm not super happy about. Maybe I just feel guilty about not calling them on the phone or something. There's all sorts of people who come to the table. And yet every single Sunday they come, I get to hand them the bread and say, this is given for you. This is shed for you. Because it doesn't matter what I think at communion. It matters what God thinks. And God says, everyone is welcome. You are welcome, and everybody else is welcome here to taste love and forgiveness at the table. So what do we do with communion? What do we do with it in the end? Is it just to fill us up and then nothing? Well, let's go back to what we talked about first. We talked about how God's love is found in the feeding and all of the ways Jesus shows love. Maybe in feeding us with communion, Jesus is sending us out to love. Can you think of ways that we can love other people? Well, we already talked about the ways Jesus did it. Maybe we can do similar things. Maybe we can heal the sick, or at least be with them. We can talk to the outcast. We can mend broken relationships. We can eat alongside people we don't like or we don't know. And we can say that God loves you. The meal fills us and flows out of us so that we can share the good news that is the feast of God to the entire world. Even if it's not someone you want to share the feast with, that's a person who God says go and share love with. Or someone who might need a little pick-me-up. That is a person God says go share the love of the meal with. Can you think of someone you would love to share communion with? Why would you share it with them? Can you think of someone who you would love to be able to put the bread in their hands and hold up the cup to them and say, this is Christ for you. This is love for you. Can you think of someone you wouldn't want to do it to? Or someone you would have some reservations, be like, I don't know. Why do you think God invites us to share the meal with that person too? Why do you think God says that person deserves my love too? And you are the one who has to give it. Finally, guys, I want to ask you this question. I want you to think about the times you've taken communion, and I want you to answer, what's your favorite part of communion? What about it brings you joy? What about it inflames your heart? What about it centers you again on God? Could be anything. Could be the eating, it could be the feeling of peace you get. It could be looking around and seeing that all of these people are welcome at the meal, and indeed there's enough food for everyone. And the last thing I want to say as we finish our time on communion is I want to invite you, whenever we're next back in church, to go up to your pastor and ask to help hand out communion. Ask to be part of the handing out of communion, because when you do it, I promise you, you will feel some of the power of God, of getting to share God's love in physical form in the bread and the wine to a weary, hungry world. Guys, I've really enjoyed our time together. I'm going to let you go. I look forward to seeing you at our next set of videos when those come, I believe, in the spring. Until then, I'll see you around. I'll be praying for you, and I hope you'll be praying for each other. And I hope that you come to communion ready to receive God's love and to share God's love with the entire world. It's been great being with you guys. We'll see you all later.